I was born in Messina, New York in 1919. I was the second child of Rhoda White and Clarence Lucius Dunham. He was born in Gorham, New York, which isn't too far from Niagara Falls. His father died when Dad was 6 months old, so they never knew each other. He was an only child. His mother was 41 when he was born. And it was not an easy life for her, but she didn't have a happy time and didn't spread happiness to her son either. She was very domineering, and it was her way or the highway, and it was not a happy childhood for him, but he was very bright. Her name was Rhoda Booth White. Her father was Selden White, who was, I've never quite known, apparently kind of the offshoot member of a Canadian family. But some of them had come to the United States, and I'm not too clear on his background. But he was a dear, sweet, gentle man who he tried to run about 5 businesses and ran them all into the ground. So their life was never affluent. Mother, as I said, I think she finished high school at 16 and qualified for a state Regents scholarship. Cornell was not going to accept her because they had an age standard of 17, and her birthday wasn't until the end of October, and she really had to fight and argue to get them to accept her because she couldn't guarantee that she'd qualify the next year for that same scholarship, and she couldn't go without it. My father did his summer work primarily paving brick roads around Ithaca. It was nice, hot, heavy work, but he was studying. Well, he had 2 degrees from Cornell, and I never quite understood. One was a Bachelor of Arts and one was a Bachelor of Chemistry, and I never understood how they dovetailed. But during his undergraduate days, he and my mother met there. She was a scholarship student, and they were cast as the hero and the heroine of a French play by a French professor there at Cornell, and that was how they met. She graduated in 1911. He finished his first bachelor's degree in 1912. She was quite young for being in college. And then he took a 2-year extension for this Bachelor of Chemistry, and so he finished in 1914. And so they saw each other when and where they could, and finally were married in 1916, much against his mother's wishes. She thought he should wait. He should not marry until she was gone. And so she and my mother were not the best of friends. Mother had respect for her, but not admiration. Dad had a job with Alcoa, as I said. He started working for them when he graduated from got the second degree at Cornell. And he was working in Niagara Falls, and then he was sent to Messina. His specialty was in refining the ore from bauxite, and he got to be a troubleshooter all over the country where they were doing these processes. But the highest he ever made was $14,000, and he was one of the upper members of the staff at Alcoa. It was a small town. Everybody knew everybody else. I could run free at a very early age because there were no major dangers around, and it was your typical small town life. And Tom was born there, my brother, in 1917. and I was born in 1919. I remember once going down the steps of the high school on a toboggan because the steps were covered with ice and packed snow. I remember in the summertime seeing my first airplane. It was a barnstormer, a veteran of World War I with his little tiny plane. He landed in a pasture maybe a quarter of a mile from where we lived, and all the kids in the neighborhood went flying up there to see this fantastic thing. And I think he was selling rides. I can't remember how much it was. Whatever it was, I didn't go for a ride at that point. I can remember helping clean the chimneys on the oil lamps, and I can remember being given a candle and I could leave it on until it burned down, just a little stub end of a candle, and I was allowed to let that burn itself out. I remember getting radio, and it was like the early days of television. When it first came into the house, it was the only thing anyone paid any attention to. And I must have been about 4. And I couldn't get my dad's ear for anything because he was just glued. Oh, I've got Cleveland, We had a car. It was a Rio, and the 4 of us could sit side by side in it. It was a little Rio coupe, but it was kind of ruby. We lived 90 miles from my grandparents. It was at least half a day's trip and usually longer because you also measured the trips by how many times you had to stop and patch a tire. And you carried a little kit with you that did that. The only real memory I have of my grandmother Dunham was going to visit her, and she put me up on a table to help me off with my coat. I was scared to death of her because she was such a forbidding looking woman, and she didn't. I guess that's why I remember it so much, because she actually was paying attention to me. When I was 5, we moved to Pittsburgh because my father was transferred to the home office of Alcoa Aluminum Company. We lived in Pittsburgh first in an apartment and then bought a house where I lived until I went away to marry. The air was full of soot because it was, as you say, industrial, and there were no controls it was soft coal and no controls on anything. But there were a lot of things about it that were good. It was big city versus small town, and it took some adjusting. But I got to the point where I could get around pretty well on my own. I do remember that when I was 13, I got my first bicycle. I'd saved for 3 years for it and saved up the magnificent amount of $13 and bought a used bicycle. And suddenly I had wings, and how I loved it. Nobody worried about it. I just could just go off anywhere on my bicycle. And there again, even the big city was a relatively carefree situation. So growing up in Pittsburgh had its pluses. One of our favorite haunts was the Carnegie Museum. They had, and also a beautiful library, one of the original Carnegie libraries, and the museum had all sorts of fascinating exhibits. They also had a lot of art. They had an art museum also. I went to high school when I was 12, and I was pretty young to be there. I graduated when I was 16, and it was not a good thing. I skipped long division. I skipped fractions. Taught them to myself, but not very well, and I still have to use all the fingers and sometimes my toes to figure out some of this stuff. But I was fairly good at math, so it wasn't a total loss, but they were great for skipping them. Altogether, I skipped 2 full grades, a half a grade at a time. I had an older brother, Tom, who was 2.5 when I came along. He got the brains from both sides of the family. And along with it, he got social, outgoing things that eggheads quite often don't have. So that he was a delightful combination of fun and extreme knowledge, to the point of his getting my mother very upset because he was getting A's for work that she knew weren't worth A's in his list of capabilities. So she finally, this was during the Depression, she finally went to a very high standard private boys' day school, which was just around the corner from us, fortunately, and told them that she would work for them for his tuition. She would teach, she would tutor, she would do whatever they needed. And so she earned his education for about, I think it was 3 years. And he ended up, when he graduated from that school, he and a classmate of his were 2 out of the 3 top students in the whole county, Allegheny County, which includes all of Pittsburgh and a lot of other stuff. He died 2 years before she did. He died when he was 3 days short of 22. Wait a minute. He died in 39. He was born in 1917, so he was just short of his 22nd birthday. He was a junior at Cornell, paying his whole freight with scholarship funds, and one of the top men in his class in mechanical engineering. Anyway, one of his classmates at Telluride had just had the brakes relined on his car, and Tom took it to take a girl out one night dancing. And I think he didn't have his glasses on because he was vain about that. It was night. They were going out to a place that was on the lake, but you had to get into it, you had to make a fairly sharp turn and go down this steep driveway. Well, he didn't spot the turn in time and suddenly slammed on the brakes and turned the wheel, and the brakes locked because of this new lining. And the car went, and there were no seat belts in those days, and he was thrown out. It really ripped me apart, but it totally destroyed my parents. And I've always felt that had a lot to do with my mother's death, because I think stress opens the door. The cancer is floating around there somewhere, probably, in all of us, and this horrible stress, because she had built up all her hopes and dreams in him. And then she turned all that around and tried to put it on me, and I couldn't take it. And we had some awful shouting matches, and to this day I regret that bitterly, but you know, you can't change it. And as a result, I don't think we ever totally made our peace with each other, because by the time I realized that she was in trouble, it was too late to get into discussions of that nature. I went off on my own at 16 to go from Pittsburgh to St. Louis and then on to Columbia, Missouri, to this school. And little did I know what I was getting into. I do appreciate it because it helped me grow up. Since I started college at 16, I was still pretty naive about a lot of things. Maybe I still am, but it gave me a little bit of time to grow up, and a few credits to start out with, so that it did take me an extra year to finish my college education with the change of schools and the change of curriculum, but I've never regretted the fact that I did it. I just think it was kind of a waste of time and money. It was funny, my mother took some of the papers into the office at Cornell when she was up there on a visit, and there was something about they'd gotten a critique from one of the teachers that I had at Stevens saying I lacked abandon, and the Cornell person kind of laughed, and he said to my mother something about what is that, and she said, I don't know, but I hope she stays that way. It was a happy time for me as far as that was concerned. I didn't really overload myself academically, but I did take quite a mixture of courses. I had a great social whirl, So it was more fun for me than it was truly educational, and it didn't prepare me for a whole lot, I must admit. I think my allowance was $1,500. And I usually didn't go over that. The only time I did was that last year when Eddie and I were engaged, and he was in Cleveland and I was in Ithaca and then Pittsburgh, and I was back and forth every once in a while. I can remember finding things in my mother's desk, for instance, about overdue bills at department stores. And she was having to kind of go from, I'll pay this one this month and I'll pay this one next month, that sort of thing. But I remember one time going down, and she told me I could buy myself a skirt. And I went down to downtown Pittsburgh on my own and found this skirt that I just thought was the bee's knees. And it was $5.95, and I'd never spent that much before in my life. And I took it home, and Mother took one look, and she said, she saw the price tag, and she said, "No, it's too expensive. Take it back." So I had to take it back and settle for one that was $3.95. A girl that Eddie had been dating, who went to Denison, was on her way home to White Plains for Christmas, and was going to stop and stay overnight at the Websters, and they were having a party for her. And Eddie had invited Tony and told him that he was perfectly at liberty to bring me if he'd like to. So he did. And that was the first time I'd ever seen the house. And then during the Christmas holidays, Tony came and visited me, and I realized that that was not for me. So when we got back to school, I said goodbye. And about the same time, your dad and this gal from Denison said their goodbyes. She was the one on that one. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I got a phone call from your dad asking me to out to dinner. Well, getting out to dinner during the Depression was a real deal. So even if he'd had 4 antennae, I probably would have accepted. But I was thrilled, and we had sort of an off-again, on-again relationship for quite a while. Then I guess it was early spring of my senior year that he proposed to me. But he had said goodbye to me at one point. And so I'd been dating a little bit but not enjoying it much. And then all of a sudden I got a letter from him saying he realized that wasn't what he wanted. And we got married in Ithaca on October 11th, 1941. We had planned originally to be married on my father and mother's 25th anniversary, but Mother had died in April. So instead of having a big wedding on their anniversary, we had a little wedding as soon as we could feel comfortable about making that drastic a change. He had gone to Cornell in the medical school in the class of 1904, I think it was, and got his MD degree. But during the course of his college career, he was earning his expenses by working part-time for New York Life Insurance Company. And as a result, he liked that so much, he never practiced medicine a day in his life. And he and Mother met. She was also from that area up around Oneonta. And she had gone to normal school, but not to... at that time, I think that was a 2-year program, and she was a school teacher when they met. And they were married 1908, I think. And they had 2 sons. Bob was born in 1909, and I think they lost a baby in between Bob and your father, who was born in 1914. And then Grandpa Webster got the mumps, and that was the end of the line for that. don't get me started on her, because to me she was one of the most wonderful women that God ever made. And I just feel so fortunate to have had her in my life, and to, having heard some of the horror stories about my mother's mother-in-law, I was very sensitive to the fact that I was blessed with this one. She was not as highly educated, you might say, in terms of academics as some of the others in the family, but her brain was clicking along at a high rate of speed all the time, and her interests were very widespread. She read so much really good, interesting stuff, and she was a fascinating woman just to sit and talk to. She was the wonderful reader aloud, and there was this regular routine. Grandpa would go in and lie down on the couch, and she would sit there in the living room in a comfortable chair, and it was usually pretty, well, it was a lot of history and economics and government and things like that. It was very little fiction. That and Grandpa's nap after lunch. He had the radio going top decibel with the noon news, and he would go in and lie down with the newspaper and with this radio going full tilt, and kids running in and out and everything. And the minute the news ended, the radio stayed on, and he took a 15-minute snooze, and with the newspaper over his face, and then he'd get up and go off and do the next thing. But it was a regular part of his routine. He was one of the pioneers in the sale of life insurance to doctors or prospective doctors. He started out working with interns, and before he got through, he was working with freshmen in pre-med. But I think the money was loaned at the princely rate of 3%. But out of that, he made a good living. He began branching out and going to medical schools, and because he had this doctor's degree, he could walk into any hospital or any medical college and say, Dr. Webster to see Dr. So-and-so, and no one asked him a question. He loved to fish, and he was able to combine this whole thing very nicely by selling policies to people who lived in good fishing areas, and then servicing the policy while he was fishing. But I think that time that your dad almost drowned in the Tanana River, I think he was servicing a thing in Alaska. The story as he told it was that there was a ferry across the river, and they were riding in an old open touring car, and the ferry was just like a scow with a floor on it and a piece of baling wire across each end. For some reason, the driver put the car in reverse, and your dad was in the back seat. I think the others had not gotten in, and the guy put the car in reverse, and it backed right off the ferry into the river, which was loaded with glacial silt, so you can't see 3 inches through it. And fortunately, it had that canvas top on it, and there was a bubble of air in there, and Dad got up there, and the driver dove in and went and rescued him. But the aftermath was that they had to stay there at that ferry location. There was a ferry, I don't know whether it was the ferry owner's house or what, but they stayed there for several days while Mother took all the clothing and washed it, because everything was so full of this silt. And they had to wait for another car to come and take them, and it was a kind of a wild situation. The relationship of Grandma and Grandpa, to some extent, I didn't quite understand it myself, so I don't think I can. I do know that for many years, Grandma was, what he wanted to do was fine with her. And it was only when she was beyond its helping her at all that she started telling Alice and me not to allow that to happen to us. Mother, I think, was so appreciative And in fact, she expressed herself in those terms, as she was so appreciative of the life that Dad provided her with, that she might otherwise not have had. I got the sense that she was sort of the only unmarried daughter in the family, and she pretty much made up her mind she was never going to marry, because I think she was 30 when they finally married. And they did. They traveled a lot. They had mutual interests in history and all the rest of it, as I said, and with all their reading. And but this father makes the decisions and mother comes along for the ride was very, very much a part of their modus operandi. It was a place I always loved to go to, because to me it was almost like a haven. And particularly, I think, since I had lost my mother, I enjoyed the opportunity to spend time with Eddie's mother, because she was so down to earth and sensible and yet flexible. When they got married, they bought a house on Catherine Street over in College Town, which is about this angle. And it was a big house, and Mother rented rooms to students to kind of help pay the rent or whatever. Because in the early days, I can't imagine that Dad made a tremendous amount of money consistently. But as time went on, he developed these ways of finding the right people and financing them and making a little bit of money out of that, as well as making sales consistently. But he did it for 63 years. The stone that went into the house, $1 a wagon load. I wonder what it would be now, $10 a piece of stone. And your father always felt that he'd help build that house, because he was kind of a gopher carrying stone up to the mason. The mason would stand up there on the ladder, or one mason, I don't know how it all worked out, but one mason would be up there laying this stone, and he would call down to the other one what size piece he wanted, and then Dad would trot it up the ladder. He had a very nice life as a kid, and he and George Hamilton used to get together and reminisce, and he and Don used to get together and reminisce, and their childhoods, and some of it sounded pretty wild. I don't think that anybody was watching them as closely as they might have. Dad started out in college in the class of 35, but with a change in course and a year out for health problems, it ended up taking him 6 years to get through college. But he changed from liberal arts to hotel school after a couple of years, and then had a year off when we think probably he had mononucleosis. So whatever it was, that and the recovery and his trip to Europe. They traveled as a family, They went to Europe once, I think. They went to Alaska as a family when Dad was 10. I don't know how old. I've got amongst the archives there a copy of their passport picture when Dad and Bob were probably 15 and 10 or something like that. And in those days, you did family passports. You didn't all have individual ones. He was in law school at Cornell when he and Alice met. And he quit law school. I think he decided it wasn't for him. And what he really wanted to be was a writer. And that was not acceptable. And of course, then he got married and started building a family, and he was under the gun. So Grandpa arranged for him to go to, I think they went to Akron. I'm not sure where they went, but they were somewhere else working for some other agent at New York Life, and then moved back to Pittsburgh, and Grandpa built that house for them.
Ithaca.
That's why there was no unrest when we inherited 102, because they'd had their house built for them. When Dad and I met, Dad was working with Grandpa, and it was not a happy situation, but Dad was determined enough to get away from it, and he did go, and he worked for a while in a hotel in Glens Falls, New York. But in the meantime, he really wanted to work for Stofers, so when they said, we'd like to talk to you about that, he went off like a rocket and got that job and was working there when he and I got married. The problem that for both Bob and Dad, I think, was that if you didn't do it Grandpa's way, it wasn't being done right. And he never hesitated to tell you so. And he wanted to, because they were working to their idea with him, to his idea for him, they were at his beck and call 24/7. And that was not a happy way to lead a life, to be somebody's flunky. He always had to tell you what you'd done wrong, and he was generous to a fault, as you're aware. I mean, over the years, he's done an awful lot for his family, but he always wanted to know what you'd done with it, and then tell you you were a damn fool to do it. And I just had enough. But I tell you, I stood there and shook like an aspen tree after I told him it was none of his damn business, and in those exact words. So. But it was so funny when I saw that funny little grin on his face, that that's what he'd been trying to get me to do. And I think it was a combination of, well, good for you, and well, I made it. Yeah. But we got along much better after that. I was afraid of him, I really was. Originally, we were married in October of '41, so in a couple of months, the war started. Our part of it started. Dad had been called into the Army, into the draft, and had flunked the physical because he had a trick knee. And so they sent him back home. You know, it was, here goes the conquering hero, and then here he comes back again in 24 hours. What do you do for an encore? But it meant that he could go back and do his work, and that was before we were married. That was the spring before we were married. And it kind of opened the door for us to get married. Well, then, of course, as the war went on, you were born, you were 5 months old. And by that time, he could see that they were changing the rules on trick knees, and that he much preferred to make his own choice as to what kind of service he did. And he got wind of this special program they had for the Supply Corps in the Navy. And he knew he qualified for it, so he went down, and he just barely was not too old. I think they did have an upper age limit on it, but he just barely was okay on that. So he went and applied and got that. And that's when you were about 5 months old. We left Detroit, and you and I started camping out with the grandparents here and there while Dad went off to war. But he spent 6 weeks at Babson Institute taking a crash course in how to belong to the Navy. And then he never went overseas at all. He never went on shipboard except one day on Lake Michigan out of the training station at Great Lakes. And but he did a lot of advisory stuff and inspection stuff. And first we were sent to Great Lakes, and I got out there complete with toddler. He'd been trying to find us a place to live, and that always was fun, trying to find a place each time we were changed. And I went out there with this toddler. He met me at the station and informed me he was leaving that night for a week's trip to North Dakota. And here I am dumped in this house. I don't even know how to, it had a coal furnace. I didn't know how to run it. It was interesting. We were there for a while. I can't remember exactly how long. I do know that I was pregnant with Tom before we were transferred to Charleston. But we were camping out here and there in some rather interesting housing situations. It was not easy because service personnel were not popular with landlords because they came and went. But and moving around with a family was very difficult. Tom was born in the Charleston Navy Yard, and when he was just a few months old, that's when we got out of the service. We were in Cleveland, and my dad had come down, or he came that day just to spend the day because his birthday was the next day. And of course it was a Sunday and he needed to be back home to work on Monday, but he came just so we could celebrate the day. And some Stouffer friends of ours had invited the whole Stouffer gang to their place for brunch. And we stopped and picked up the wife of one of the fellows who was working that day. And she said something about they bombed Pearl Harbor, and we said, "Oh, they can't. You must mean the Philippines." No, it was Pearl Harbor. And it wasn't until we got to this party and got in contact with radio. In those days, you didn't have car radios, so we got to the party, and yes, that's what would happen. So I was so wound up in just trying to keep the family going and the household stuff. I don't, not big decision-making stuff. I wasn't really as keyed in, plus the fact we probably didn't subscribe to a newspaper. I don't know whether we did or not. And you didn't have TV. We did have radio. But I had Dad right there, so I didn't get all in a twizzle about there were so many wives whose husbands were somewhere overseas and they weren't sure where, and of course they were just glued to everything they could, any information they could dig up, whether it was radio or newspaper or whatever. We had restrictions on meat and on shoes and sugar.
Tires.
Oh, tires. Cars and gasoline and tires were a big problem. We had our car put up on blocks at one point. When we went in the service, our car was sitting in Grandpa Webster's garage on blocks for a while until he talked us into selling it, which we never should have done. But anyway, there were a lot of restrictions, and some things were almost impossible to get, even if you had the proper documentation they had these little red coupons that you, like milk bottle tops that you gave in for every pound of meat. And butter, I think, was also rationed. Clothing, shoes. Because Dad was in the service, a lot of it, we didn't have the problems. We still did with the food, but of course he was gone a lot of the time, so I had the use of his supply, because when he was traveling for the Navy, he got his meals. And so I had not the more difficult end of that. I do remember saving up bread stamps for his birthday, his surprise birthday, and buying a great big standing rib roast, and a dog got into it. We had to cut one piece off it. Tom was just a baby. He was born in September of that year, the end of September. And you sat in the middle of, we went out and bought a car, and you sat in the middle of the front seat, and Tom was in the bassinet in the back seat, and they didn't have these nice car seat things in those days. And off we went. We went back to Ithaca, and the Stouffers wanted Dad to come back to Cleveland. They had kept him on the payroll the whole time he was in the Navy for all of like $50 a month or $25. I've known, but it helped, whatever it was. And so they were ready for him to come back whenever he came, and they wanted him to come back to Cleveland for a refresher. During that week, they kept changing their ideas about where we were going to go. Originally, they had said we would be sent to Pittsburgh, and that was fine because that would give us a place to, Dad and Sally had room for us on a temporary basis while we found a place to live. Well, before we ever followed through on that, they said no, they were sending us to Philadelphia. Of course, they'd known each other so many years, and Dad was 50 when Mother died, and I thoroughly endorsed the idea that he shouldn't stay by himself forever, and he made some passing remarks about it was time he made some other life for himself. But I was very surprised when he announced that he thought he would ask Sally to marry him. I think it was kind of the easy way because he'd known her. She needed the financial situation was not good for her. She was on a teacher's pension, which was peanuts. And so I don't think basically originally there was much love involved, but it was kind of a marriage of convenience. It changed, but it was pretty rocky at first. At one point, Dad asked for her for a divorce because she picked at him about everything, and he wasn't used to that. She and my mother could not have been more different coming out of the same gene pool. They must have dipped in the opposite ends of it because they were so different, not only in intellect, but in thought process, in attitudes about the world and everything. After they decided against the divorce, I think they made their accommodations to each other, although it was still had its prickly moments. And I think it was somewhere at that point that Dad got more involved with drinking. I don't know that you could say that he was a true alcoholic, but he was using it as a crutch a lot. And the last few years were difficult. We never got to Philadelphia either. They said they were going to send us to New York. Well, by this time we're getting a little punch drunk. And Dad had been looking for housing in Philadelphia with absolutely no luck. And New York, of course, was even worse. And they were paying us what he had been getting before he went in the service, $200 a month. And he had met a man who worked at Purdue, Mike, forgotten his last name, who was in the food service, or the dormitory service at Purdue. And Mike told Dad that if he ever was looking for a job to let him know, because if he didn't have one himself, he knew so many people in the Big Ten that he could easily give him some leads. So Dad called Mike and or wrote to him, and Mike said, come. And we ended up at Purdue. They had built some professor-style housing out off campus, but they hadn't made a dent in their needs, so they started those black and whites, which were amateur attempt at group housing or something, or cookie cutter, and that was terrible. Well, the house was the only remaining one of a whole group of houses that had been moved earlier off property that Purdue wanted for dormitories. And they had gotten all the others off, and that one was sitting on the corner. And behind was this huge 600, or I think it was about 600 bed men's dormitory. And Dad was working in that dormitory building. And it was a nice big 4-bedroom house. It had only a bath and a half, which got a little tricky at times, but it was a very comfortable, older style house. And they informed us one day that they were going to jack the house up on rollers and move it onto some land they had out in the country. And if we liked it well enough, they would sell it to us. And we liked the house, and they claimed it would take 3 weeks or something to make the move. It took well over 3 months. The weather was awful, and it rained and it snowed and it froze and it thawed. It was a mess, but I know that we were out of the house for Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. Well, both. Chuck and I lived with friends, and you and Tom and Dad were in a guest apartment in the men's dorms. Even after we moved into the house, we were dealing with some unfinished things like no floor in the basement and no driveway and no front steps to amount to anything, and it was a sea of mud, and it was kind of incredibly awful. Well, Barbie arrived after we were pretty well settled out there, because, as I say, they moved the house when Chuck was just maybe a year, a little over. He was unhappy because he felt he'd reached the top as far as Purdue was concerned, and there was no way to really improve on his lot, and so Dad's feelings were not at all hurt when this headhunter came looking for him. University of Rochester. That was a total disaster, because the man he was working for was Grandpa with a German accent. It was just terrible. Well, first he was supposed to have an office, and it turned out they put a desk in the hallway with all the clatterty-bang of a kitchen and dishwashing and all the rest of it. And that was his office. Then they started wanting him to get results within 2 weeks of his arrival on the scene. He was still trying to find out where the sugar was, that sort of thing. It was just awful, the whole thing. And he had a nervous breakdown and was hospitalized for a while. So then that's when he got the job at University of Buffalo. They had the man who was running or contracting the food service at the University of Buffalo was a piece of work. And the two of them didn't get along too well. He was another, it's my way or the highway sort of guy. But when Grandpa died, then Dad, in working with his estate, and with Bob, realizing that Bob had no interest in doing anything about it, the business end of it, Dad said, well, with Grandpa gone, I could do something with this, and he did. He really enjoyed what he did. Well, it was interesting, when we went to go house hunting, we found one house up off the Four Corners, I can't remember, Hanshaw Road area up there somewhere, that we thought it had possibilities, and we took Grandma to see it, and she said, I wouldn't spend all my savings on real estate. And then, so we looked it over again and decided it wasn't the right house for us. And then we saw the one on Highland Road, and we took her to see that, and she said, it's worth every penny. So that was encouraging. And we bought that house, and I liked it. Realistically, we just couldn't handle it because the taxes were just eating us alive.
Yeah.
Plus, the house was just at that age where things major problems begin to develop. And with the two of us and a dog rattling around there, except when the occasional twig came for a visit, it was much too much house for us. So. And yet I was amazed that he gave it up so readily when we decided to go to Florida. I was trying very hard to stay out of the way while he made up his own mind, because I didn't ever want him to say, well, you made me do it. Because that can create some real tension somewhere along the line. We went down to St. Pete for several years on vacation and liked it for a vacation location, but we weren't particularly in love with it for a place to live. But then for 2 or 3 years we didn't go down, and when we decided that it was time for a vacation, we were talking about it, and Dad said, do you want to go back to that place where we've been before, or try something new? And I said, well, I've always heard a lot about Sanibel. Why don't we divide it up? Go to St. Pete for a week and then go down to Sanibel for a week. Well, the minute we got on that causeway, I just could feel the springs letting go and serenity hitting me. And apparently Dad had the same reaction. The next day we were looking at real estate. We just were hooked. And by the end of that week we had made a deposit on a condominium on Sanibel. And we stayed there, let's see, we went in 74, and it was 1977. By that time we'd moved Dad and Sally to a nursing home in Florida. Not on Sanibel, but just off Sanibel. So we realized that this love affair with being on the beach before dawn and after sunset had kind of run its course, and there were problems with trying to be full-time residents of a resort community condo, because all the work ended up on those who stayed. It became fairly obvious that maybe it wasn't the best place for us to be. But then we realized we could enjoy it without living on it. So we moved into South Fort Myers and Meyer Lee. And lived happily there for, let's see, we lived in Meyer Lee from 77 to 83. And by that time we'd built the house up in Sugar Mill Woods in Citrus County. Harry and Esther Duncan were moving up there, and we kept saying, you can't go up there, there's nothing there. And so one time they said, well, come with us. We have to go up this weekend for something or other. Come with us. They hadn't exactly made up their minds, but they were looking. So we went up and we started looking around, and finally they took us to this Sugar Mill Woods. And they were looking for a lot. And we looked around, and when we saw what they were and the price they wanted, it just seemed like something you couldn't beat. But then after Grandpa Dunny died, we suddenly realized that we were now free to travel. And we'd been putting that off for so many years, for one thing and then another. And that there was no way we could take decent care of that house and be off to the wilds of Australia, New Zealand, and all the rest of it. So, time to move again. And Dad said, do you want to go into another house somewhere else? So there was nothing local that pleased us. And go into a condominium somewhere? And I said, no. I said, I'm tired of moving. Let's investigate this whole business of life care communities. They were just beginning to be built on every corner practically. In the meantime, we heard about Bentley, and again went and fell in love and signed up within a week and never regretted it. Dad loved it, and that amazed me again. I tried not to push too hard because I was totally sold on the whole concept, and then I wasn't sure he'd go for the dinner in the dining room with a... At first you had to be fairly decently dressed. Now it's a lot more casual. But he loved it. He became a peacock. He had more loud sports coats than I'd ever known him to wear, and he just had a wonderful time. And of course he loved the sociability of all the people, and he got involved in being on the council and all the things that he usually ended up being involved in. Every morning he'd say, oh, I'm so glad we decided to come here. So, and it did just for us exactly what we were looking for, and that was, we knew that unless we ended up on the same plane that crashed or something equally awful, that one of us would outlive the other. And probably I'd be the one who would live longer by statistics, and also because of the difference in our ages. And so, and it did exactly that. We got in there while we were both in good health. We made a lot of friends. We were able to live just the way we would normally would in a nice condominium with added perks and added amenities. And then when I did have to go it alone, everything was in place. Australia, New Zealand was our first after we moved. That was the biggest one, and that was the first. We also went to Alaska on a cruise ship, a Cornell trip. We went to, on the little ship, we went to the Alexander archipelago of Alaska, which is very different from cruise ship stuff. We went on a trip up the Columbia and Snake Rivers on those little ships. We went to Norway on one. We went to see Frauke and Carl twice. We kept traveling, and we kept making plans and then having to cancel them, and we lost deposits all over the world practically. Our last one was we had to give up on a trip to the Galapagos. That was when they'd given him a 6-month window with no exams, no checks-ups, and everything was fine. And it was just after they'd given him that everything started to go wrong. And we discovered this growth in a place they hadn't been checking. I think at first he thought he was going to lick it. And he wanted chemo and he wanted all this. Well, the chemo just about killed him. In fact, I think it did accelerate his going. But for that, I'm eternally grateful because, the last few months of his life were so miserable for him that, I think there came a point when he realized that he was no longer going to lick it. He'd always said, it's a breeze, it's a snap, I feel wonderful, let's go. And all of a sudden he didn't. Having him there at the care center was a blessing. People tried to tell me I'd wasted my life because I'd never had a career. I said I had a career, and I liked the results. I was a mama to 4 children. But I guess if I had insisted on it, I could have had a career. I never felt any great push to be a career person. Rocky. It had its wonderful moments and it had its rough moments. I don't think I ever fully recovered from that episode in mid-career there. We made our accommodations to each other. I had to do a lot of pulling up my socks and accepting what I couldn't change. There were a lot of things that he denied himself for you kids to have special things. His working hours were wacky, and it was hard for him to interact with you kids as much as a lot of fathers did. But when he was home, he was usually home. In other words, he wasn't off playing golf or whatever, or going fishing or hunting. He was usually thinking of things for us to do as a family. So to that extent, I appreciated it. As time went on, he mellowed a good deal on the frugalness of our lives. He enjoyed traveling and I enjoyed traveling, and and of course we worked in the kitchen in a very compatible way. It was awfully hard for him to let loose of the purse strings. Getting my own checkbook took me about 5 years from the time I really started insisting on it. And then he gave me a desk size, great big thing like this. I said, I can't carry that in my purse. He said, you wanted your own checks, here are your checks. I think my mothering was erratic at best. And there were times when I had to go it alone on that because I never believed in the wait till your father comes home school of discipline. I always felt the discipline had to be close enough to the thing that caused it to happen, so you'd know why you were being, whatever was being done to you. So I ended up, and I think you all consider me as the disciplinarian. And at times that kind of hurt. I think I've been marvelously lucky in many ways. I guess I've known a lot of people who have had a lot more problems than I have. I've tried to be flexible and I find myself not doing a very good job sometimes. I've tried to stay out of your affairs, and I'm not always completely, any of you, I'm not always completely successful. Basically, I wouldn't want to try to figure out how to change it to make it any better.